Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Annalise Riles, the Executive Director of the Institute and Associate Provost for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. We meet today 1 month and 1 day since Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. Over the last month, the world has seen both the indiscriminate killing of children, prisoners, and hospital patients, and also the fierce and courageous response of the Ukrainian people, determined to defend their dignity and their freedom. And during this time, the Buffett Institute of Northwestern University's Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies program, directed by Jordan Gans-Morse, together with leading scholars from our newest partner university, the Kyiv School of Economics, have hosted multiple discussions on this war, covering everything from propaganda and public opinion in Russia to military strategy. On this 1 month anniversary, we're reconvening our original panel to look at the big picture and once again discuss the conflict from as many different angles and perspectives as possible. Although this is an academic discussion, we are all here because we stand in solidarity with our Ukrainian colleagues in condemning Russia's actions, and we want to pay profound and particular respect to the scholars and universities of Ukraine, which are demonstrating such courage and hope and doing all they can to resist and also to provide for the survivors. So we're once again delighted to welcome to this panel President Timofey Milovanov, the president of the Kyiv School of Economics and advisor to Ukraine's president, Professor Timothy Brick, the head of sociological research at the Kyiv School of Economics, Admiral Michael Rogers, senior fellow and adjunct professor in the Kellogg Executive Leadership Institute, Ambassador Ian Kelly, ambassador in residence at Northwestern and former ambassador to Georgia, and also a former US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Professor Jordan Gans-Morse, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Northwestern's Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies program, Professor Ian Hurd, who is the Professor of Political Science and Director of the Weinberg College Center for International and Area Studies, Professor Juliet Sorensen, Clinical Professor of Law and the Director and Founder of the Northwestern Access to Health Project, Professor Olga Kamenchuk, Associate Research Professor in the Institute for Policy Research and Associate Professor of Instruction in the School of Communication, Professor Peter Slevin, Medill School of Journalism Professor, Professor Jennifer Chan, the Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine, and Dean Gail Woloshek, our newest contributor to this discussion, who is Associate Dean for Graduate Students and Postdoctoral Affairs in the Graduate School at Northwestern, and is also Professor in the Weinberg School of Medicine's Department of Radiation, Oncology, Radiology, and Cell Molecular Biology, and is herself an expert on Chernobyl and an advisor to the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's truly an honor to be with all of you today. So for our audience, we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Please submit your questions via the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if you would like your question directed to a particular speaker, please note that as well. And Timothy Milovanov, let's begin with you.
Oh, Annalise, I apologize. Timothy Milovanov, he's not has some
here.
delays.
That's
yes.
right.
He will
Okay,
be here
great.
maybe in 10-15 minutes, but I can jump in. And
well, Timothy Brick, let's begin with you then.
Yeah.
So, so last time you spoke to us from outside of Kyiv, and tell us a little bit about how things have changed for you and your colleagues since we last spoke.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for this opportunity to talk to you and to your audience, and also for creating these new partnerships and collaborations with our university. We appreciate it a lot, and it is a great honor for us. So to answer to your question, a lot of things has changed, even though, only 1 month have passed, but I think for me, it was almost like a year. I am in Kyiv, in the capital city. I have decided to stay here And I have to say that Kiev feels like a safe, strong place, and I'm quite confident to be here. The city has become a fortress. It is very well protected. The supplies are working, and people have very strong morale. Of course, we were quite stressed during the first days of the invasion. Nevertheless, I think it is quite obvious that the promised blitzkrieg did not happen. The Kiev was not taken during 2-3 days. It has managed to protect itself and even to strike back, to get back some territories in the suburbs, which gives a lot of hope to myself and to many other Ukrainians. Unfortunately, some other parts of Ukraine were not so lucky. Obviously, there were a lot of devastating and terrible news from cities in the north, in the south, in the east. Kharkiv, Sumy, Melitopol has become, has become quite famous, but for very bad reasons. Yeah, this city, 90% of the city is destroyed. Every day there are combats, street to street, house to house. And we work very hard to evacuate people. Our government works very hard, and volunteers. And we have news, and our government reports that Russian forces have transported some of the civilians to Russia, and we interpret it, we see it as a crime. So basically, they have taken our civilians. So yeah, there are things that are really bad in terms of humanitarian crisis, and I'm talking about the cities in the south, east, and north. But there are also reasons for optimism that our cities stay strong, like Kiev, that quite a lot of civilians managed to escape or to transfer to Western Ukraine. And I can also comment about our work life, what changed in our work life. The university is working, even though we work online. This week, we again started teaching. So our undergrad students now attend online classes. Our master students, they are, as adult citizens, they feel very responsible and engaged in what is happening right now. So they work as volunteers daily, so they are not ready to study. And our professors and researchers, they work mostly on analytical tasks. We provide analysis to our government, but also to foreign partners, to our diplomats. So we don't really have capacity to teach except undergrad students. So that's why we initiated several other activities to substitute teaching, but also to show our resilience and to increase solidarity with the world. So we initiated several activities. One is a series of lectures, which we called Global Minds for Ukraine, and we invited speakers like Paul Krugman, Tim Snyder, Michael McFall, Fiona Hills, Christia Freeland. So quite a lot of intellectuals, diplomats, ambassadors. So far, we have had about 10 guests, and other guests will be speaking with us in April and May, and we created a special YouTube channel with all these lectures. We will run a new seminar in economics called Frontier in Economics for Ukraine. And this is going to be very hardcore econ seminar, where people talk 40 minutes about mathematical models and some econometrics. So it's in sharp contrast to these lectures of solidarity, but this is also important for our academics, to be engaged intellectually. And also we have launched a new joint effort with other universities in Ukraine. So we are not working alone. We are supported by private and public universities, alumni associations. We are endorsed by Ministry of Education and the Office of President, and we will announce it in a couple of days. We are working still on the press release and the webpage, but soon we will announce a new project, which is called Ukrainian Global University. And this project aims to support displaced students and faculty who are both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And the idea that this umbrella organization will help all displaced students and faculty to find places to stay, to finish their degrees, to receive their salaries, to work on research projects. And we will have two tasks. One is a matching task. So this is like a marketplace to connect universities and students. But we will also provide services. We will provide programming. We will verify diplomas. You know, suppose that there is a student who is from Kharkiv or Mariupol, and she cannot even get her diploma because her university was bombed. Yeah. So we will make sure that we can certify this person. We will verify her credentials, and she will be able to get into some university of her choosing. Yeah. So we will provide services, and we will provide matching platform. And this is also important for us. We have had many discussions with partnering universities, those universities who are willing to support us or to host students or to donate lectures and professors or to write grants together. Yeah, so there are so many people and organizations who want to help us. And every time we meet with these people, with our friends, we also emphasize that this is important not only for Ukraine, this is important for the whole world, because frankly, there are also other nations that are displaced and refugees, and we don't want to stop here. Yeah, it's I think my colleagues agree that you cannot understand the humanitarian crisis really unless you experience it. So of course, as analysts, as scholars, we can talk about it, but once we experienced it, we really realized how bad it is and how important solidarity and humanity and what can be done on the ground, because we also experienced some inefficiencies from big international organizations. So that's why we had to create our own fundraising or our own NGOs to deal with things on the ground. And we want to, to extrapolate, to scale it up. So drawing from this example, I hope that our organization will be able to help to students from other nations as well. But of course, this is kind of step-by-step process. Yeah, but I think it's important to think about it now and to put it in our strategic documents. So that's what we are doing now. And we raised $12 million already in our fundraising. Also with your support, and you circulated our donation page extensively, so thank you very much. We were able to raise $12 million, and we spent this money to purchase and to deliver medical kits to local communities, to territorial defense, to state services that are responsible for further logistical dissemination of these medical kits. So I guess that's it shortly, but my colleague Timothy Milovanov, he will be here a bit later, and we will be happy to answer to your questions more in detail.
Timothy,
So
that's incredible. And I just want to say, as someone who's had a tiny glimpse into the work you're doing behind the scenes, the amount of work that you've been able to get done in just unbelievably challenging circumstances is just really, really impressive.
I will add one small thing. Yeah. Today, maybe a couple hours ago, I checked my notes and I checked my calendar, and I realized that collectively we have a group of up to 6 researchers, and so we collectively participated in 72 panels like yours. So during this month, so sometimes we had 3 or 4 panels per day, but still doing all other tasks, including fundraising and programming and volunteering and everything. So it has been a very long month, but we are, it's important for us to show this resilience, because we want to show that academia is resilient as our government, as our army, as our citizens. So we need to show some stamina here, and we are doing our best. So thank you very much.
Well, I can just say that I think on behalf of all of us, we're here to support you in any way. And the Ukrainian Global University sounds fantastic, and just look forward to your partnership on that. That's fantastic. So just let us know what you need, and we're here. So let's press on and maybe come back to Timothy Milovanov when he can join us. So let's turn to you, Michael Rogers. So Admiral Rogers, many outside of Ukraine have been taken by surprise by the resolve and fierceness of the Ukrainian armed forces. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. military assistance in this conflict and your evaluation of how that piece is going?
Sure. So The United States military, as well as members of the NATO alliance, have been providing military assistance to the Ukraine for several years now, before the conflict itself. In my previous life, for example, as the commander of Cyber Command, we provided cyber expertise. We deployed it to Ukraine to assist our Ukrainian teammates with cybersecurity, to address network security, et cetera. In the buildup to the Russian invasion, and in the last month, what you've seen NATO and the US focus on is military assistance in the form of weapons designed to destroy tanks, medical supplies, drones, cybersecurity assistance, small arms and ammunition. But it's also interesting in terms of what the US and the alliance have not provided. In fact, there was a NATO summit. President Biden attended this week in Europe. President Zelensky, prior to the summit, continued to reiterate, look, if our goal in Ukraine is to drive the Russians out, it's not just to stop them from advancing, but we want to drive them out. And to do that, we need aircraft, tanks, missiles, artillery. We're very appreciative of what US and West is providing, but we're interested in not only that, but more. NATO and the US continue to say, look, with respect to military assistance, we want to provide Ukraine defensive and humanitarian capabilities, but we do not want this conflict to broaden. And therefore, we have drawn a fine line with respect to the delivery or provision of weapon systems that we believe could be interpreted as offensive in nature. It's why the US, for example, and the NATO alliance have said, we are not going to go with a no-fly zone over Ukraine. We are not going to provide aircraft. We're not going to provide tanks. The assistance that's been provided has, helped to strengthen and support the truly intensive and amazing efforts on the part of the Ukraine military, its government, and perhaps most importantly, every citizen in that nation. It is amazing as a military individual to watch the strength and the capabilities of this resistance that Russia is experiencing.
So given your particular expertise in the cyber area, could you talk a little bit about, are you surprised at the way the cyber dimensions of this conflict have or have not unfolded? And what do you make of Biden's admonition that we should perhaps prepare for cyber attacks in the United States?
So first, I believe there's a lot of cyber activity going on in Ukraine. It isn't necessarily getting the biggest media reporting, in part because it has not been perhaps as successful as the Russians hoped. But I think also the Russians were not as focused on the application of cyber weapons, cyber capabilities as we thought they might be, because number one, I believe they thought this was going to be over relatively quickly. And so they felt they didn't need it, particularly since they were committed to kinetic destruction. You don't necessarily have to use a software program to destroy or deny access to a server farm when you can literally bomb the building the server farm is located in. Secondly, I think they also felt they were going to need access to this infrastructure, the same network connectivity that they might be interested in degrading or denying or destroying when it was under the control of the Ukraine. They felt, hey, when we come in and take over, we're going to need to use that to communicate to Ukraine populace as well as our own forces in Ukraine. And then thirdly, I believe they also said to themselves, look, we don't want to escalate this beyond Ukraine for right now, which is another reason why they have not, to date, executed significant offensive activity with cyber. There is other reconnaissance and preparatory activity ongoing that the Russians are doing with respect to critical infrastructure in the US and the West. We've seen the Russians in the last several weeks, reconnaissance on the power grid, for example, in the United States. What I think is important is, are the Russians at a point where they feel they need to rethink their calculus here? Look, all this military activity is designed to facilitate or drive some political outcome, whether that political outcome is a peace treaty or formal agreement that the Russians believe provides them advantage and answers their issues with respect to security in Eastern Europe and along their border, whether it's the acquisition of some segment of Ukraine territory, whether it's the imposition of some alternative political government in Ukraine. The military activities are all designed to achieve that. Those activities are stalling. When we spoke as a panel several weeks ago, my characterization was the Ukraine resistance is dogged, determined, and very effective, but the Russians continue to make incremental advancement. I would tell you in the last 3 days, you have watched the Russian, particularly ground activity, just grind to a halt. They continue to do strikes and kinetic damage, but they have been unable to acquire control of significant additional territory now for much of the last week. And in fact, in a couple of places, if you heard, in suburb of Kyiv and one or two other places, have actually been pushed back slightly. That leads me to believe they're at a bit of a pivot point now. They've got to decide, do they want to continue what they're doing with the hope that perhaps by resupplying, increasing the level of military capacity they have within Ukraine, they can somehow achieve greater control of more Ukraine territory? Or do they believe, hey, we've got to pivot to a different strategy because this one is not working? Remember, one of the reasons I thought they went after Ukraine civilian infrastructure, why they went after Ukraine populace, was I think they thought that this would energize the Ukraine government to move into negotiations and to potentially conduct some form of peace treaty or political framework that the Russians felt would answer some of their issues or concerns. While there have been peace discussions now for several weeks, the terms that the Russians are trying to get were unacceptable before this armed invasion, and to Ukraine, they remain unacceptable now. So the negotiations have not resulted in the political outcome I think the Russians were hoping for, which means they've got to ask themselves, do they need to up the pressure here, either apply more military force or apply a different set of military capabilities? Do they need to try to expand this a little bit, cyber disinformation, as a way to put more pressure on those governments in the United States and the West that are sanctioning Russia? The next week, I think, is going to be very interesting here. We're going to see if the Russians are going to pivot into something different.
So, okay, so on just that point, I have to ask you about the veiled and not so veiled threats of using a nuclear weapon. So what is your thinking about the likelihood that that might happen? And what are your thoughts on what response it would engender from US and NATO allies?
So number one, the Russians know that US and Western concerns about the use of nuclear weapons is a significant factor in our decision calculus. We always, having been in discussions in the sit room in the Oval with two presidents on things like this, it is always part of our concern, and it always is a factor, if you will, in our calculations as we're thinking both politically and militarily, what might the US and the Western alliance do? The Russians know that. So it's one reason why they were very quick when this started to wave the nuclear card, to remind America and the West, hey, we have nuclear weapons here. I think the actual use is not, the potential for actual use is not high, but I would say one thing. Russian military doctrine under Putin for the use of nuclear weapons has changed. And the Russians for about the last decade, if you're into military strategic thinking, which I know most of the audience is not, in the last 10 years, the Russians have argued internally that you can use a nuclear weapon at a tactical level, a small yield, and not trigger a strategic or mutually assured destruction response from the West, where the West, the US and the other nuclear powers immediately launch almost everything they have. The Russians really believe that you can separate this tactical from strategic use of nuclear weapons. In the West, we rejected that philosophy 50 years ago. We believe that, hey, look, if you use a nuclear weapon in any way, you have crossed a threshold that is going to engender a strategic response from the other side. So we've always argued, if you're going to use nukes, you really need to think that this is the worst case scenario and you are going to get a massive nuclear response. I don't think when it's all said and done that the Russian inclination is to go with a nuke, because in part, if they did that, then there would be a very different US and Western response. I mean, the inhibitions that we have put in place, for example, about provisions of offensive weapons, you'd see those gone, I think, very quickly. We'd start providing, and we'd potentially look at perhaps the US directly might say that it would want to get involved here if the Russians were to go the nuclear route. But right now, I'd say I don't think there's a high probability.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So let's turn then from military strategy to diplomacy. So Ambassador Kelly, give us your assessment of the discussions around possible diplomatic settlements that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, please.
Well, thanks, Annalise, and I'm really pleased to be on this panel, particularly with Timothy from Kyiv. I don't see Russia at a point where they're willing to enter into any kind of serious negotiations towards a diplomatic solution to this crisis. I think that Putin is still counting on using extreme, overwhelming force, particularly artillery and missiles, to try and force Kyiv to make the kind of broad concessions to his demands, basically to hand over the sovereignty of Ukraine to Russia. But there's a lot of diplomatic activity going on, obviously. And yesterday was an absolutely extraordinary, and I don't want to get too hyperbolic, but it really was unprecedented to have a US president participate in 3 multilateral summit meetings in one day. And these summit meetings really included, not only the leading European powers, but also some of the G7 nations as well. I think that if you look at the three summits, some of the common threads among all 3 was of course sanctions, and agreeing to remain united in imposing sanctions and preventing any kind of circumnavigation around the sanctions. Of course, assistance to Ukraine. All 3 pledged to pick up their humanitarian assistance to help receive and accommodate refugees, but each one had a different focus depending on the organization. NATO, of course, was security assistance. I think that the EU, they were talking about energy security to a great degree, particularly getting Europe weaned off of dependence on Russia for fossil fuels. And then the G7, they focused a little more on food security, and that is going to become a bigger and bigger problem for the global economy, particularly for underdeveloped nations, because of disruptions in wheat and other grain exports from 2 of the largest producers, Russia and Ukraine, because of the war. I think if I have to identify where I was disappointed, I think I was disappointed by the lack of outcomes out of the NATO meeting. I think that I was looking to see more assistance to help the Ukrainians with these terrible bombardments with surface-to-air systems. I was hoping to see that some of the Eastern European countries that have Soviet-era systems like S-300s and S-400s, that there be an agreement to find a way to provide those. I think if I had to identify the most impactful outcome, or as we say in the State Department, deliverable, it was the creation of this task force, the joint US-EU task force to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. If I were in the Kremlin, that would be the one that terrified me. If you look at how much Russia depends on payments, especially from Europe for oil and natural gas, This, I think, this is something that could really, really change Putin's level of support if 40% of his government's budget begins to shrink significantly.
That's fascinating. And so when you think about possible, proposals out there, compromises, we hear talk of different options. Do any of these look plausible to you or at the moment, do we not have anything that looks like a plausible diplomatic solution?
Well, it's interesting. I think that there have been changes in the rhetoric on both sides in terms of what each side wants. I do think that the Russian rhetoric is avoiding the kind of robust talk about regime change, denazification, decapitating whatever of the Ukrainian government. You don't hear that as much now. I understand that Zelensky in his Zoom speech to the NATO leaders did not mention NATO membership. These are all interesting. I don't know if you want to call them climb downs, or they're interesting revisions of some of the demands that we were seeing before. I caution people from believing that the Ukrainians would back off completely from the idea of security guarantees that NATO affords anybody. I can't see them giving up their NATO membership, and Timothy, you obviously would have more insight into this, but I can't see them giving up their NATO aspirations without getting some kind of security guarantees from leading powers like the US and UK. I've heard mention of Turkey as well. But again, we are not at a point, I think, where especially the Russian side is willing to give up on some of these fundamental demands. I think the NATO part of it was just a very, I wouldn't say insignificant part, but a small part of their ultimate war goals.
Timothy, would you like to comment on this at all?
So regarding the NATO aspirations, yes. Well, I think that Ambassador Kelly is correct, saying that Ukrainians have their own strong preferences to have guarantees of security. And even today, there was this online conversation with the chief of office of the president. His name is Yermak, and he was talking with the Atlantic Council today, and he repeated this message again, that Ukrainians need security guarantees. And from my understanding of the situation from the ground, we still have preferences to join NATO, but we understand that our Western partners could, well, basically it's a political decision. Yeah, they could be worried or even afraid that Russia is not going to accept it. So it's much easier to create some new form of security protocols than to suggest NATO. So I think it's on the table. I think it's a political discussion. And given the strong preferences of Ukrainians for security and for ensuring the security, I think we will be flexible to accept whatever strong options are there.
That's great, thank you. So Jordan Gansmore, turning to you now, as a political scientist, could you talk a little bit about how you see the geopolitical implications of what is unfolding here, and in particular, looking into your crystal ball, what you see as the future for Russia in particular in all this?
Yeah, thanks, Annalise. And like others have said, it's an honor, Timothy, to see you here again. And I was going to say, in terms of what you were talking about at the beginning and the amazing things that you guys are doing and how much you're doing, is someone who's periodically in touch with you every couple times a week. To be a scholar trying to keep up with you when you're in a war zone is humbling. When I'm thinking, how is it that I'm doing half as much as you are, and I'm in outskirts of Chicago. So as everyone's already said, it's always an honor to be here with you. On this question of geopolitics, I think if we look in a big picture, or take a big picture view of this for a second, there's only kind of three large-scale ways that this ends, and this is by far the least likely, and I won't spend much time on it, but it was what Russia certainly expected, and what many in the West seem to expect, which is that Russia would quickly be able to set up a puppet government and be welcomed enough by Ukrainians, or be able to put down whatever resistance there was quickly enough, that they would end up, without needing any sort of negotiation, to be in control of Ukraine. And the geopolitical implications of that would have been horrendous, right? And Putin would have had his appetite whetted, all his understandings of the world would have been confirmed. And so I think the West owes Ukraine a huge debt already for making that scenario more or less off the table. I mean, knock on wood, right? I mean, things can change in war, and that's not my area of expertise, but things would have to change dramatically to end up in this scenario. But that would be the geopolitical implications if we had been there. The second scenario, and I think this also is fairly unlikely, but maybe it's just my hopes, but more likely than scenario one, is that somehow Ukraine is able to not only repel Russia, but to go on the offensive enough to push Russia actually out of Ukraine, and whether that means out of the Donbass as well, that's a complicated question, but at least to get back to where we were on February 24th. And that somehow Russia actually, at that point, without having some sort of negotiation, pulls back and goes home. That seems, I mean, even if militarily we get to that point, that to me seems highly unlikely and problematic, because I don't see Putin as somebody who's going to accept that. I can't imagine that if Putin if it sinks in finally to Putin that he is losing and is likely to lose, I think we're going to see a very, very different Putin, and one that's going to look a lot more like what pretty much everybody who's an outspoken vocal leader in Eastern Europe, in the sense of the Baltics, in the sense of Poland, certainly whenever anybody from the presidential administration of Ukraine speaks, and I don't know what every Ukrainian says, but many Ukrainians are saying the same thing. We're going to see a Putin who looks much more like the type that they talk about, which is a very different Putin than we still seem to talk about in the West, and that's going to be somebody who would rather blow things up and take everybody down with him than go down himself. That's not, I mean, the idea that Putin is going to say, there's this thing called mutually assured destruction, and I don't want all the Russian people to die. At this moment, he still thinks somehow this is going to be beneficial to him, I believe. And so that all makes sense. But if he's at the point where he's about to outright be defeated by Ukraine, a country that he won't even admit is a country, you'd have to imagine his state of mind can be very, very different and be very frightening. So I don't even think we need to think about deeper geopolitical implications. We'll be in a crisis geopolitical moment at that point. And in between these two extremes, we're back in the world that Ambassador Kelly was talking about, and that somehow some negotiation has to occur. There's such a range here that it's very hard for me to speculate in the broad sense of which scenario would be most likely and which would come out. But I can say what they depend on, I think, and what the kind of range of possibilities are. And what they depend on, is two things. One's the obvious thing, is just the balance of power on the battlefield, right? That's going to, even to get to negotiations, that's going to matter, and what type of outcome is going to depend on who feels like they're winning and so on. But the other is whether Putin remains in power. And to be clear, I'm certainly not advocating regime change. I think that it would be in many ways good if Putin somehow is taken out of power, but I don't think that in any way should be what the West or NATO advocates openly. But if Putin leaves, it opens up a number of possibilities because someone else can then blame a lot of the debacle on him. And without that, you have Putin personally invested in this, and I just can't imagine on his side that he's going to back down. And I can't imagine on the Ukrainian side that they're going to be willing to make any concessions to Putin. Whereas, again, I won't speak for the Ukrainians, but it would certainly change the game if Putin himself is not the one sitting across the table. So those are the two things that I think are fundamental to understanding what's going to happen. And in terms of what's at stake geopolitically, to me, it's all the big things that we talk about. And this is why, again, I don't see this as a war, against just Ukraine. I see this as a war that already is global in many ways, and it's going to change. It's going to determine these questions about going forward in the 21st century. Are we still in this world order where international law and sovereignty matters, or are we not? It's going to determine this question of whether this so-called democratic recession is just the beginning and it's going to keep going in that direction because everybody's going to look and say democracies are weak and authoritarian regimes are strong, or is it going to be the opposite? We're relatively small Ukraine. To be clear, Ukraine's not a small country, but just compared to Russia, relatively small Ukraine, pushes Russia back, that would be a phenomenal win for democracies. And in terms of Russia itself, it's going to depend really. It's going to create this sense of whether Russia is an aggressive, right, somehow at least not rising, but maintaining itself as a superpower, whether it stays more about what we had thought about it for the last decade or so, which is as powerful enough to be a spoiler, but not really a power in a geopolitical sense, or whether it's so defeated that somehow within Russia, they begin rethinking this and say, maybe there's a better role for us that's more constructive on the international stage. I'm not saying that's likely, but those are the three things that are being determined here, along with all the bigger picture things.
That's really interesting. Let me just ask you about a slightly different topic related though, which is the refugee crisis. So the UN estimates that a quarter of Ukrainians have been internally or externally displaced, and that half of all children have been displaced. What do you talk to us a little bit about the geopolitical and social impact of this size of movement of people? Do you think that Poland and other countries will continue to show the kind of support they've been showing, and what else needs to be done about this?
There may be others here who can speak better to this than I, so I'll be brief, but my sense from when I've talked to people in Eastern Europe, ranging from colleagues to even grad students that we have here at Northwestern and so on, is there's no question that Ukraine has been welcomed with open arms, and the world seeing that. And of course, there's all the various implications of being European or not European, and how this refugee crisis has looked similar or different to those in the past, and so on. But even Poles or Czechs that have mentioned this, they themselves seem worried that this can't last if it gets if a refugee crisis goes on long enough and takes up enough resources. And has no determinate end that in sight, that's going to be hard for any society, and that some of the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiments could arise again. That's the one thing I can really add to that. And like I said, I believe there's probably others here who can say more about how likely that is. I would personally also really like to see the U.S. do more in terms of opening our borders and bringing more people directly here.
Absolutely. So Ian Hurd, let's turn to you. So when we spoke a month ago, you said something really, really remarkable. You said that this crisis had renewed the relevance of international organizations. So how do you assess the role the UN has played so far of this month? The Security Council, the General Assembly, the Secretary General. How are you seeing all this now?
Well, the response to the invasion certainly has activated a bunch of international organizations, as you mentioned. But of course, once activated, they can reveal their strengths and also their limits. Within the UN, many of the operational agencies are working full tilt to do things like provide emergency relief and help displaced persons. But of course, it's the political organs that get the most attention. The Security Council had several very dramatic meetings over the last few weeks. But of course, the council isn't really designed to take action when one of its permanent members is the aggressor. So it doesn't do that. What it can do is provide a stage for performances. It's Broadway for diplomats. And the Ukrainian message has certainly been amplified by its access to the Security Council, as well as from the show of support that's come from the broad coalition of countries that are standing behind it. For other organizations, it's interesting to see that the International Criminal Court has launched investigations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, taking advantage of a kind of ad hoc jurisdiction that it has in Ukraine. The International Court of Justice sprang into action. It took a case last month that's technically about how to interpret the Convention Against Genocide, but feels a little more like an expedient path by which it gets a platform to express its opposition to aggression. But of course, none of these institutions is built to stop a powerful military that its leaders has set on the march. And so we need to look at these organizations in a different register in a way. What they are designed to do, I think, is kind of twofold. On the one hand, they can shape a little bit of future possibilities. That is, they can smooth a path for future events that make things more or less likely down that road. And then they can provide a platform for public expressions, for public performances, for the kinds of political outputs and messaging that have been so important. Now, these have real political weight, I think, but none of them are meant to stop an invasion.
So what about the EU? So Ambassador Ian Kelly said something remarkable a few minutes ago. He tells us that perhaps the most significant thing that happened yesterday was this new US-EU task force. And some people are saying that this conflict has achieved in a month the kind of unification that Europe has been unable to achieve in a couple of generations. So what do you think about that? Do you think that this is going to have an impact and that Europe will emerge a much stronger union?
Well, I think for now, certainly the European Union countries have been strengthened together by the sense of a kind of imminent crisis. I think there's a strong sense among them of a shared fate and a common interest in preventing Putin from emerging from this emboldened, stronger than he was before. But at some point, when the imminence fades, the bill will come due. And at that point, the costs are going to fall differently on different countries. And that's going to be a moment where we'll see dynamics in the EU that are quite different than what we are sensing right now. And I mean this in terms of the costs of accommodating the refugees and migration flows that you mentioned, the cost of replacing Russian oil and gas, and the cost of a potential shared EU defense infrastructure. All three of these mean different kinds of burdens on different countries in different positions with different capacities to pay and different kinds of vulnerability. That might not be that far down in the future, but I think at that point, the unity that we sense now is going to be heavily tested. I think the longer term is important too for the anti-Putin sanctions that we've talked about. At the moment, the EU and the UK and others are trying to make it hard for the Russian elites to access their wealth and their houses and their toys abroad. I think it's a very useful device in a kind of global fight against oligarchs and corruptions. But if 3 months down the road, the sanctions go away and these people get all their goodies back, then not much will have been accomplished except causing, the Italian government to pay the holding costs of somebody's yacht for the 3 months in between. So assets have been impounded, so they can't be used now. But if they're given back to the oligarchs in due course, then not much message has been sent at all. So I was quite impressed with Biden's message yesterday about seeing the crisis or using the crisis as a catalyst on the turn away from Russian petrochemicals. But I think we can also see it as hopefully a catalyst for improving the cause of transparency in these financial flows and cut back the power of the tax havens and the oligarchs.
Fascinating. Timothy Brick, I just want to give you a chance to respond to that. What is your view on the sanctions? Are they having an impact in the view of most Ukrainians? Are they enough? Are they effective?
Well, first of all, I have to say that we are impressed that so many sanctions have been implemented and that there are so many actors internationally who are actually actively engaged in searching for new ways to create new sanctions or to fight loopholes. So our team is working with many embassies and diplomats. So sometimes we identify loopholes and we send emails with reports, and sometimes we are approached. So our Western partners ask us what kind of sanctions, what can they do even more to sanction Russia. So this attitude and this commitment is fantastic, and we are very grateful. Nevertheless, of course, Ukrainians and Ukrainian policymakers and diplomats, we all have this strong opinion that first of all, there is no place for some fatigue. Yes, so sanctions, they should keep going. And second, that there are still more sanctions that can be implemented, and including sanctioning board members and specific individuals who work in Russian state companies. We think that there is still more work can be done in oil and gas sector. including raising tariffs. So basically, if you cannot make an embargo, you can raise tariffs and things like that. And we provide some econometric models to support these ideas. And yeah, and there is still this discussion about SWIFT, which is still a discussion, and there is still a discussion about engagement specifically of some major Western countries like Germany. So of course, we believe that more things can be done. And since we are talking with the American audience here, I think that we would appreciate also your diplomatic support in convincing other countries to, to be strong on this front.
Very interesting. Thank you. So Juliet Sorensen, Ian Hurd mentioned the decision of the ICJ. When we met a month ago, you unequivocally stated that the invasion was a violation of international law. And since then, the ICJ has proved you right. So what is the impact of this decision, given that Russia didn't even show up to plead its case? And do you think there are any other ways that Ukraine can get remedies on this decision or any other body's determination that this is a violation of international law?
Well, thank you, Annalise, and thank you again for convening these truly important discussions. As Ian alluded to, the ICJ ruling, and indeed the case itself, is a funny one. It was brought by Russia. That is to say, the case initially was, the case was brought by Ukraine, seeking a rejection of Russia's assertion that the justification of its invasion of Ukraine was Ukraine committing genocide against the Russian people. And I'm going to say something unequivocal again today. That's baloney. All right. It is patently false. There's absolutely zero evidence that Ukraine has committed genocide against the Russian people. And it is simply an excuse. Yes, the ICJ appears to agree with that conclusion, but it's only made a preliminary finding in that regard. Ukraine asked the ICJ, in fact, to say the opposite. That is to say that Russia is engaged in committing genocide against the Ukrainian people. And I would caution actually that genocide is a technical term, and it is not obvious that we are seeing acts of genocide in what is happening on the ground. Other international crimes, absolutely. War crimes, yes. Crimes against humanity, possibly. Aggression, yes. But genocide, that's not obvious to me, nor is it apparent to the ICJ based on that preliminary finding. There are a few other avenues going forward in terms of the international legal process. They could include the International Criminal Court, although the audience should remember that the ICC only has jurisdiction over individuals as opposed to governments or state parties. So that's one distinction from the ICJ. But there have been allusions to the possibility that one day Vladimir Putin will no longer be in power. How that comes to pass is an open question. But once that happens, Vladimir Putin becomes an individual with possible criminal exposure. And if he were to leave Russia, voluntarily or otherwise, jurisdiction could be asserted over him. And for the lawyers and law students out there, that would be personal jurisdiction that would allow either an international court or a national court, including a US court, to assert jurisdiction over him on a range of substantive legal bases.
And since you were talking about the technicalities of different kinds of crimes under international law, could you tell us a little bit about what is the technical definition of a war crime, and have war crimes been committed here?
So war crimes are those violations of international humanitarian law. They could be that could be an international law created pursuant to a treaty. It could be international law that has come that is regarded as customary law pursuant to long pattern and practice. So those violations of international humanitarian law that incur criminal responsibility under international law. War crimes, by definition, must take place in the context of an armed conflict. Sometimes you hear this term, the law of armed conflict. That armed conflict can either be international, as the current situation, or non-international, that is to say, civil conflict. A war crime can arise if armed forces are treated in a way by opposing forces that violate international humanitarian law, or civilians. So let me take one example, the use of chemical weapons against troops in a different country. There has been allusion, of course, to Russia's nuclear power, even if that is cabined, so to speak, to use against military sites or armed forces. That would be a war crime because it is a violation of international humanitarian law. Offenses against civilians, and perhaps the best examples in recent memory include examples in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, also constitute war crimes. But again, these also overlap with other international crimes such as crimes against humanity.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Now, maybe turning from law and diplomacy to communications and social factors. And Timothy, please feel free to chime in on this as well, because I know you're a specialist in this area as well. So Olga, last time when we spoke, you told us something really interesting. You said that while a majority of Russians support this war at that time, so it wasn't with the kind of enthusiasm that you had observed in the case of the invasion of Crimea. So 1 month on, how would you evaluate the level of popular support for this war in Russia? Do you see any changes?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Annalisa, for organizing this event. There's quite some things which changed in this month in Russian society. And some things remain the same. One thing which is the same is support for the war. It's still around 2/3, which is 66 to 70%, depending on the pollster. It's still not the Crimean consensus that we have seen in 2014, when over 90% of Russians supported the war, the invasion to Crimea and annexation of Crimea. But still majority supports the war, and all the rankings have actually grown, approval rating of Mr. Putin and so on. Largely it is driven by immense propaganda efforts set by Kremlin and repression and blocking of free and opposition media reporting. Mass protests also still there, but they grew in over 100 cities around the country. Over 15,000 of protesters were arrested. People get arrested even for just holding posters with quotes of 6 commandments, thou shalt not kill, or even if they hold a blank piece of paper, just white paper, and they get arrested for that. The protest spread from purely street protests at the beginning to open addresses and open letters signed by thousands of academics and journalists, addresses and letters against the war. And that's in the situation where opposition leaders, all opposition leaders who could mobilize and organize the protest are assassinated, jailed, or exiled. Mr. Navalny, by the way, just got 9 more years in jail on yet more fictitious charges. So this remains as it was. What happened? What is new since then, right? There are new laws which were aimed to stifle reporting about the war and repress the anti-war position. People are risking very severe sentences for their position and actions. For example, 20 years for consulting foreigners, which can be interpreted now as treason. 15 years for fakes, quote fakes, about the army, which is actually calling war a war. Or for showing destruction that Russian army brings to Ukraine, or for bringing out the topic of atrocities which are brought up by Russians in that war. After Putin's attack on opposition, he recently spoke up and specifically talked about the opposition, called anti-war protesters being national traitors, scum, flies to spit out. A new wave of attacks on dissent has started in the country. Russia's Office of Prosecutor General has started cases against several bloggers living in Russia and abroad, not only in Russia, for posting about the war, for calling the war being the war, for demonstrating the destruction of the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, for pretty much bringing up the truth. Numerous international media, CNN, ABC, Bloomberg, CBS, suspended operations in Russia due to potential threats to their journalists. This, of course, also affects the amount and quality of information we get from the ground. Almost all the opposition media was shut down since the start of the war. TV Rain, Echo of Moscow were shut down. International social media such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram were blocked. Moreover, Meta was recognized just recently to be an extremist organization. Google News were also blocked. Meanwhile, over 150,000 Russians fled the country since the start of the war, mostly to the neighboring countries in the Caucasus, Turkey, but also other places. Mostly those are intellectuals fleeing, academics, IT sector, the brains of Russia. Russian authorities try to prevent the escape of intellectuals. They try to prevent especially the IT specialists fleeing the country. So as to Russian society, I think the immigration of intellectuals from Russia will continue. The protests will go on. The repression against opposition will even increase further. There was a question I saw in the Q&A about the China factor, because China plays significant role in this whole situation. I want to say a couple of words about that. Well, Russia is clearly pushed to the east right now, but it has always happened with Russia in relation, with the US when there was problems with where were some kind of problems with the US previously. But while both regimes, Chinese and Russian, are pretty close ideologically, and both are interested in shaking up US dominance in the world affairs, but China is also a very pragmatic power. Its trade balance with the EU is around $800 billion, with United States 750 billions, together $1.5 trillion. And with Russia, 150 million. So it's the difference is significant. Xi is to be reelected as the head of the state in the forthcoming Congress of Communist Party in the fall, and he doesn't need any secondary sanctions or further economic problems right now prior to that. So while China remained largely neutral in this situation, and even avoided to call this war a war, although a couple of times they did. And while Russia seems to have reached out for China for economic and military assistance, China seems to refrain from active participation in this war crisis that Russia started. But they might, I think, provide some help under the table, limited, but that's the most that I see so far. So that's in short about the moods in the Russian society and the potential for the development in the future.
And how, to the extent you're able to speak with people since you got back from Russia and you've been here, as I understand, for the last few weeks, how are people processing the sanctions and the impact on them, the fact that credit cards don't work, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, what kinds of response does that generate? Does it generate animosity towards the West? Does it generate animosity towards their government, some combination?
Well, the people who mostly feel the sanctions right now are the ones who were against the war. Majority of Russians don't travel abroad. They don't have passports even to be able to travel abroad. I mean, travel passports. Some of them are affected by some of the shortages of some goods, like sugar suddenly disappeared. Now they're trying to buy that. As previously, the anger is directed not towards its own government, by the majority of the population, but towards the West, which tries to stifle the independent Russia fighting with the Nazis. Majority of the population did buy into the story of Russia fighting the Nazis in Ukraine. But some things, some of the sanctions, some of the problems that Russians have experienced so far, people are trying to find the ways around, like with the credit cards. Credit cards actually work domestically. MasterCard, Visa, they all operate domestically. Unless you order something from abroad, and almost nobody does in the country. Ruble fell, but now it's actually growing again. So I think that the effect of the sanctions will be mostly felt over time. The longer the situation continues, the longer the war continues, the more pressure domestically we will see towards Mr. Putin. In fact, what really is dangerous for Mr. Putin domestically is not all those intellectuals protesting. He doesn't care for them. And there's not so many of the academics or journalists to protest. It's much wider masses of people coming to the streets, and that will happen if economic situation deteriorates further. It can happen. And then that's what will contribute to domestic destabilization and more attention towards what is happening in the country. Well, one reason why Putin is introducing so much of new laws trying to repress the news reporting, and that's why police is so brutal against the protesters so far.
Very helpful, thank you. So Peter Slevin, turning to you, you mentioned a month ago that you felt that the coverage by the global media was pretty good. What is your analysis 1 month in? What has surprised you in what you've seen, positively, negatively? What would you say?
Sure. Well, thanks, Annalise, for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm learning a lot just by listening. It has been an extraordinary month for the media, and to my eye, we're seeing the power of journalism to explore and to expose the reality of war, and this particular war. If you think about what the average reader or viewer knows of the brutality of the Russian invasion and its impact on millions of innocent Ukrainian civilians, we know we know about that because of these sort of the extraordinary exploits of reporters. And I think the facts documented, gosh, day in and day out by journalists on the ground, thanks to the Ukrainians who are trusting the reporters with their stories, have been essential to what we've been talking about so far today. The strong, really quite extraordinary anti-Russian response around the world that everybody's talking about today. And I think the good news, if one can call it that, one month in, is that the coverage and the attention is not, at least so far, going away. And in the United States, where we have a notoriously short attention span, especially when it comes to the media, it'll be up to the media to continue the coverage. And I think so far that is happening. I have to say that the coverage also puts the lie to the often cynical and self-interested argument that the media is corrupt and cannot be believed. This has become a cottage industry, as we all know, among the followers of Donald Trump. But it's not just an American thing. Autocrats all over the world have adopted Trump's phrase, fake news. And the coverage of the war in many ways is a counterpoint to that because the images don't lie. Now, building on what Olga is talking about, this hasn't stopped the Russian government, which is heavily censoring the news in Russia, from trying to discredit the reporting. In fact, essentially calling the documented evidence fake news. This happened to a remarkable story filed by 2 Ukrainian Associated Press reporters who spent the first 20 days of the war in Mariupol. And I'd like to talk just briefly about that story as an example of what we know and how we know it. I'm hoping we can put a link to that story in the chat for everybody to see. Because it shows what journalists are going through, it shows the stories they're telling, and it is showing how the Russian government is trying to respond. The Washington Post said of the coverage of these 2 reporters, who are Ukrainian journalists from Eastern Ukraine, that we wouldn't have known otherwise what is happening, quote, in such irrefutable, horrifying detail. And you perhaps saw the chilling photo of the pregnant woman being carried on a stretcher outside of the Mariupol maternity hospital that the Russians had bombed. That was the work of these journalists. Plus, through the days, they were steadily covering dying children and destroyed homes and life in a city without power as the infrastructure was being bombed and the mass graves. And they're filing this, they're doing this as the journalists themselves were trying to stay alive. And no small thing, find a way to file their stories and photos in a place without electricity, without cell coverage, and so on. And we know that several journalists have been killed during the war. So recognizing the power of the images to rally international public opinion, the Twitter account of the Russian embassy in London charged that the photos were fake and that the AP correspondent was a, quote, famous propagandist photographer. Obviously, he's not. So the journalists, their escape from Mariupol itself was quite interesting and it addresses this larger question of the information war. They were escorted by Ukrainian military who burst into the hospital, where at that point the Russian tanks had surrounded the building. The journalists were wearing surgical scrubs in hopes of being camouflaging themselves essentially, and they had to decide whether the people bursting in were in fact Russian soldiers or Ukrainian soldiers, and they decided to trust that they were Ukrainians. In fact, they were. And one of the officers who had come to rescue them said something quite interesting. He said it wasn't just the journalists' safety that the Ukrainian forces had in mind. The mission to extract them was about these battles in other arenas, namely the media and the information war, where this is being fought as well. And the officer told the journalists, if they catch you, meaning the Russians, they will get you on camera and they will make you say that everything you filmed is a lie. All your efforts and everything you have done in Mariupol will be in vain. So the reporters, when they left and they reached safety after going through 15 Russian checkpoints and packed into a car with 3 civilians, wrote about their experience. And this is what Mstislav Chernov wrote, explaining what the Russians intended by trying to force journalists out of the war zone, which is the broader picture, right, of trying to control information, which we know, happily, the Russians are only doing in a limited way. And he referred to impunity. He said, with no information coming out of a city, no pictures of demolished buildings and dying children, the Russian forces could do whatever they wanted. If not for us, there would be nothing. Now, they lamented the fact that they had to leave. They felt a bit guilty that they could escape. And they had really lamented the fact that there are no journalists left in Mariupol to tell that story, which, by the way, tells much about why journalists do what they do. Next time you hear someone say that, oh, it's all about fake news. But let's also recall the real danger, right? They were at grave risk as well. And I think simply the fact that we're seeing what we're seeing and hearing what we're hearing and reading what we're reading, the work of the journalists is making an extraordinary difference. And we just have to believe that they're going to keep paying attention. That's always the challenge when these things drag on and people lose interest.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Timothy, I just want to give you a chance to comment, because I imagine that you're reading about this in many different languages and reading lots of different press. How would you rate the coverage by the outside of Ukraine, of the war in Ukraine?
Well, we talked about this also, I guess, almost a month ago, and I can reiterate that journalists are true heroes here because they bravely stay in the field and they report everything. And yeah, there is a great appreciation in Ukraine for what all international journalists are doing. And in this respect, I have to say that journalists have been doing much greater job than many of our friends from academia, except this panel, because this panel is one of the rare examples when Ukrainian speakers are given equal time and we can speak from our expertise. I'm a sociologist and I can comment on sociological studies. Milovanov is an economist, he can comment about economics. Very often when we are invited to panels like that, we usually given 1-2 minutes in the beginning to say something about emotions, that we are here, either we are brave or we are scared. And then real experts have to explain us what to do and how to interpret things. American economists or maybe experts in Russian literature telling us something about, I don't know, sanctions. So this has been a pattern and we are addressing this pattern. And sometimes we are not, like right now, I'm not very polite about it. I'm not very diplomatic about it. And this is because we want to change this status quo. Yeah, this is our agenda, but I think it is also our responsibility as academics. And in this respect, journalists have developed stronger informal rules and just practices to be more, I don't know, more adaptive and more resilient to how to report on these complicated stories. And later I will also, comment something about what was said about genocide and sanctions, but later. When
go ahead. No, we don't want, we might lose you. So go ahead, say what you have to say.
Okay, so I just was making some notes, and I apologize for being hectic a bit. So I want to say thanks to Juliet for her very extensive comments. And of course, I'm not an expert in international law, but I just have an observation that I remember the times when the famine, what we call Holodomor, the famine of Ukrainians in the 30s, it was not seriously considered as genocide. And when Ukrainians addressed it as genocide, usually the response was that, it's a bias or it's a political agenda. There is no real evidence to call it a genocide. But, the time has changed. A new scholarship emerged, historical scholarship, new evidence, new historical documents, diaries, international relations scholarship, and also even new mathematical and statistical models. There were some recent publications in journals like, I don't remember the exact name. I think it was the Journal of Economic History. So there are quite new data that provides us more confidence to say that it was genocide, and it is a seriously considered hypothesis by international scholars. Yeah, it's not just a political bias anymore. And I actually believe that this can happen in future with a debate about what is happening now. So I think that, from my understanding, the way how I read social media, the way how I conduct my own interviews, the way how political scholars see what Putin is doing, I think we can say that political elites in Russia, they have this intention to kill Ukrainians because they are Ukrainians and because they represent Ukrainian state, and there is a desire to destroy Ukrainian nation and statehood. And I think this argument will be considered seriously, but with time. Yeah, right now it's war. Right now we have a lot of emotions and biases, and it's very difficult to collect evidence. But with time, I think we will talk about this argument more seriously and with more evidence. And a quick note about what Olga was saying about public perception and reactions to sanctions and the likelihood of protests. Yeah, I concur. I support what Olga just said. As a sociologist, I have to add that, we always study society as a very structured thing. Yeah, there are many different groups, and the responses of people depend not only on their income, but also on their position in hierarchy. Yeah, it depends whether you are the boss or you are an employee, whether you have family or whether you don't have family, and there are so many different informational bubbles. So it's very difficult to address all these different social groups because they all have their own cost benefits, they all have their own perceptions and narratives and biases. So yeah, every day I'm reading social media, well, those that I can access from Russia, and I was following Russian Instagram and TikTok when it was still active. And I was watching these young, charismatic celebrities with this yuppie lifestyle, and how much they did not care about what was happening in Ukraine. So I'm just bringing up this example to show that this polarization can be observed in all social stratas. There are yuppies who are concerned and yuppies who don't care. There is working class who concerned and working class that doesn't care. There are politicians who concerned and politicians who don't care. And that's why I believe that sanctions should keep going, because it looks like the one possible strategy to address all of these groups. To get into all of them, we just need to press on them all. And see that they all will reconsider the cost-benefit approach, because it's not just enough to start being concerned. It's also they need to get a reason to be more active, to go to the streets, or talk to someone. Talk to the boss, talk to the officer, talk to their your politician or oligarch if you work for an oligarch. Yeah? So we need to change this status quo as well, and that's why I think sanctions. It is important to keep them.
So I'm aware that we have two more speakers, but Juliet, did you want to respond briefly?
Oh, just briefly, Timothy, I agree completely. First, the law is an unwieldy tool to leverage at this point in the conflict. It is reactive. And because of the cacophony of the digital age and the differing reports that we're getting, it's nearly impossible to say this is evidence that leads to a particular legal conclusion. According to the Convention on Genocide, consists of acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The question of that intent is a legal question that would surely be contested, but I agree entirely that it's speculative at this point to say one way or the other. Thank you, Annalise.
Great, thanks. Okay, Jennifer, let's turn to you. So you are an expert in humanitarian medicine, and obviously we've seen shelling of hospitals and maternity wards, images that have really shocked the world. What can you tell us about the humanitarian response to those disasters that we're seeing, those acts of tremendous violence? And how do you assess it? Is it significant? Is it good enough? What more should we be doing? We can't hear you.
I'm going to try one more time. Can you hear me? Excellent.
Yes.
So thanks for having me as part of this panel. And I would say that the humanitarian response is a very large one. And you look back over many, many years to decades. And it's one in which the global system of response is highly involved, along with their ongoing responses in Syria and Afghanistan and other areas of conflict around the world. When we think about how the response is going, I like to frame it with regard to the humanitarian narrative and being able to sort of look far and wide about who's responding. And I think I just want to highlight Timothy's initial sort of explanation in the beginning about the provision of medical kits. And I think part of the humanitarian response is so powerfully local, and it should always be remembered. It should be noted and highlighted, in addition to the other components of the humanitarian response that tend to be large agencies, international coalitions. And I sort of want to frame before I pivot into the health and humanitarian response activities that I'm seeing from my perspective, but to really sort of say the response is about the narratives and the stories of the people who are affected by the crises. And for us to be able to understand that narrative means we need to listen closely to be able to understand how that response is happening. But pivoting toward a perspective of health, I'll go back to, I think, some of the numbers, Annalise, that you mentioned. We have 3.7 million refugees that United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees is estimating, and about 6.5 million displaced. And so framing that within health as we think about populations of health, our families, our communities, it's significant and it's very large, and it's not only within Ukraine, it's moving very quickly throughout many other countries. And so when we think about health in that way, we start to realize that it is so much about an individual, but is so much about broader populations over a very large geography. And that is sort of the response system or the response at large that we think about from a health perspective. Thinking a little bit more, like as someone had mentioned, if we were to look at 2 children, 1 out of 2 children in Ukraine are displaced. And when we think about the healthcare needs that they have, not only immediately formula, responses and medication and interventions for diarrhea, but really the future of decades of mental health and support. These are things that I think many organizations, and including to UNICEF, and many I would anticipate, although I don't have clarity, local organizations are immediately and in the short term trying to respond to those needs. As I mentioned before in our previous panel session, we do have a very sharp and necessary focus on trauma-related healthcare injuries inside the area of conflict. And those are important, and I'll sort of make a note about health system-related issues of attacks on hospitals. But also when we take a look at that broad view of health and communities, we're also really wanting to further describe and advocate for the indirect consequences of war on health. And that can be chronic illnesses, and we do now know that approximately 1 in 3 people, according to the International Organization of Migration, and known by many, have chronic illnesses in Ukraine. And so if we were being in a panel all together, we would look right, we would look left, and one of the 3 of us would have a chronic medical condition. And that really grounds all those numbers into what is important for us to try to help maintain healthy lives to the best of our ability. And one of the challenges with that is access to medications in areas for which corridors are intermittent and unreliable. It's the medical logistics, it's the finances, And those are all of these sort of contributing factors that really sort of says, how do we get insulin to people who need other medications for their diabetes? What do we do with people with tuberculosis who've been given 30 days of medications a month ago? What do we do, and how do we put the system back together or facilitate the system for this type of patient population going forward? So these are the indirect consequences of war, and I anticipate that it will be a long time before we really be able to understand the morbidity and mortality of the numbers that we just cannot see reported in various different channels. And these are not uncommon mortality and morbidity numbers that we won't see for some time to come that we've seen in Iraq. And these are often research studies that will come on in the future and will give us a better understanding. But I do say that the health system is really sort of that scaffolding around all of us as humans in our health. We depend on medications, we depend on healthcare facilities to be able to provide the healthcare that we need as individuals in the communities that we want to support. And some of the recent data, which is often usually an underestimate, is that about 1,000 health facilities are either damaged, and I anticipate more under non-government control. About 50% of the pharmacies in Ukraine are now closed. And so you kind of think about that scenario of, where do I get my medication? What will I do going forward? How does that affect my health? And then, what has been mentioned earlier is attack on healthcare facilities. And currently there's reported about 64 facilities that have been attacked. And, one that has been mentioned earlier is probably an underestimate. It is entirely possible that the number will grow. And all of that is significant with regard to being able to provide services. So if someone has a traumatic injury from the conflict, not being able to access a facility that's functioning, being fearful, and rightly so, to seek care, are all of the really deep-seated challenges that local organizations, community members, hospitals, international health organizations are trying to navigate to the best of their ability.
Thank you.
But I think, no problem.
That's great. Thank you. And so I just want to end with Dr. Wolashak, who's an expert on the nuclear radiation issues here. So Gail, the IAEA has been issuing statements expressing concern about the situation at Chernobyl and at other nuclear reactors. How concerned are you about an accident at one of those plants, and what would be the implications if there were an accident?
Yeah, thanks, Annalise, and thanks for having me here. Let me say a few things. I'll talk about Chernobyl because I've been in direct contact with people at Chernobyl right now. There are probably about 4 or 5 things I really worry about. Number one is the workers. As many people have suggested, they've been working long hours, crazy hours. They've been relieved, but only some of them have been relieved. And everybody knows that stress causes mistakes, and mistakes here could be very problematic. The second problem is that there are actually wildfires that are burning. There's an exclusion zone that is around the Chernobyl plant, probably to keep people out more than because it's so contaminated. But there are wildfires that are burning, and the fire brigades are not able to get there to put out those fires. So that sort of movement close to the Chernobyl power plant is going to be a problem. The third thing, as everybody knows, in 1986, there was a major accident at reactor number 4. And since then, Chernobyl's been closed down pretty much. It's not functioning as a power plant, but it's an unusual power plant. It was one of the few of its kind. It made energy, but it also made weapons-grade plutonium. And so one can ask the question, why are the Russians so keen on getting their hands on this power plant, which is not really generating energy? It's not going to stop energy to Kiev because it's not being used for that purpose. And the thought that there's a lot of thinking, it's not coming out, I think, in a lot of the discussions, but that weapons grade plutonium can be extremely useful. I was at a NATO conference a few years ago where just the amount of plutonium in the pools surrounding Chernobyl is huge. So that, I think, is probably a source, but at the same time, it's a terrorist target. And so one worries about how that can be used as a kind of terrorist site. So that's another thing that has me worried. The last thing that has me, then there are 2 other things that have me worried. The structure that was built over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, it was made to withstand the environment. it was not meant to withstand bombing. So if even a bomb goes astray and hits it, that is going to be major contamination for the area. My last thing I worry about is that one of the scientists told me that a lot of the spent fuel rods from the Chernobyl plant have been moved closer to the Russian border, and those seem to be, and Ukrainians seem to be losing control of that as well, and that could also be another major terrorist target. So I think there are a lot of concerns with Chernobyl. I could go into Zaporizhia, where Russians who are untrained to run reactors are running the reactors. So there are a large number of nuclear concerns there.
My goodness. We'll have to have you talk about this in more detail, Gail. That's really interesting. If that's not depressing enough, I'm just going to end with one last question for you, which is, we've been talking before about the possibility of the use of a limited or small or tactical nuclear weapon. Can you explain to our viewers what that is, what the physical, what kinds of injuries would be sustained by a weapon of this kind?
It depends on the kind of tonnage that they use from the nuclear weapon, but I would actually encourage all of your viewers to go to a website called nuclearsecrecy.com. It's a thing called a nuke map, and you can take the tonnage and put it in and figure out how much damage it would have, say, to Chicago or to anywhere. The smallest nuclear weapon that could be detonated of a small one is about 0.3 kilotons, and the damage from that is going to be 6,500 people dead, 15,000 injured, and that's only for the immediate reaction. Long term, most of us know, I mean, nuclear weapons are biological agents, in my opinion. They cause biological damage. So the kind of damage that can cause is very extensive. It'll be contaminated for a very long time. So maybe it's going to be 1/10 the explosion of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Still, it's going to have massive radiation contamination, cancer worries for 20, 30 years, 40 years after. So it's going to still be a very massive problem.
Well, Jordan is
really scared now that I've really scared the audience.
It's very, very important. Thank you. And Jordan is pointing out that we should mention to our viewers that we're planning a specific conversation on this issue coming up very soon. So stay tuned in your email thread for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So what I'm going to do is collect all the questions and share them out with our commentators, and hopefully we can post those along with the video with any answers folks have, if that's all right. But thank you all for these really, really wonderful, very, very just thoughtful comments. And Timothy, please know that we are just thrilled to have you with us, and looking forward to next steps in our collaboration. We believe in you, we're here for you, and we look forward to working more together in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your solidarity and for your support. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye.